The only thing I can say with certainty is what people term the phenomenon. It's
Yeah.
real. It is 100% real.
Welcome to the Gopherwood Lounge. I am ARC Press Senior Editor DJ Butler. Before we get into our conversation, I invite you to like the video, hit the notification bell, subscribe to the channel, find us at arc.press, and sign up for the mailing list, and follow us on X at arc_press. Come on in out of the rain. I am here today with a friend, fellow writer, Sean Patrick Hazlett. Sean's got quite an interesting background. I'm frankly probably not going to tell you all of it, but it includes service as a U.S. Army officer as a cavalry officer in the U.S. Army, various degrees at Ivy League institutions. Sean is also a writer. You can find his collection of short stories. It's called Alien Abattoir. He's also an editor. He's edited a series of anthologies for Baen Books, the Weird World War series, of which are there 3 of them? It's Weird World War IV,
Yes.
World War China, and what am I forgetting?
Weird World War III.
And of course, Weird World War III. Fantastic, which are all future war stories with various kind of science fiction or supernatural or paranormal kind of elements. Sean also is a podcaster, and his podcast is called Through a Glass Darkly. Through a Glass Darkly, you can find it on YouTube, but also anywhere else that podcasters are watched or listened to. Through a Glass Darkly is a podcast that I think broadly speaking deals with paranormal kind of projects, topics, not projects. That sounds weird. Paranormal topics. Sean, welcome to the Gopherwood Lounge.
Thank you, David. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So I expect we'll have you back to talk about other things in the future. You and I talked a couple days ago, and we're thinking about things we could discuss that would be sort of timely and interesting. And I think your suggestion was maybe an interesting subject would be disclosure. And I wanna cue this up a couple ways. One, I want to say first, I'm having you on not as a true believer, but as an investigator and an interviewer and an observer of the scene. So I'm gonna not assume. You can tell me otherwise. You can say, Dave, this is a thing I really believe. But my assumption is going to be you're telling me things you have observed, heard, things other people report or believe, because you've interviewed them on the podcast.
That's right.
There are conventions, aren't there, that deal with some of this stuff?
There are, but that's not that's not where I go
That's
or
not your
dwell.
source of knowledge. Okay.
Yeah, my source of knowledge is first, reading a lot of the books on the topic, because the more you delve in, the more questions it raises, the more you find and seek other sources of information.
Yeah.
The second place is obviously through interviews with people who talk about these things, and we'll call it the phenomena broadly, because it encompasses everything from UAPs, i.e. UFOs, to hauntings, to possession, demonology, the occult, all sorts of things, and some aspects of religion for that matter. But what I try to do is I interview people who talk about it. I also interview people who you would call experiencers, people who have direct experience. And I tend to talk to people, at least I started, because my podcast in particular is much like those 3 anthologies that I did, which focus on where military science fiction and fact, right, meets the paranormal. So there are people who have been employed by the government who have done some very strange things, and I've interviewed many of those people.
Yeah. So the government, this is good, because here's the sort of second thing I want to do. I want to set up my very broad, high-level understanding of what people mean when they say disclosure. Um, what is the phenomenon we're talking about? And then I'm going to ask you to give us a better explanation, someone who knows actually his stuff. So my sense, my understanding, and I am not steeped in these conversations, but I've certainly seen some, is that there is a belief, an expectation, a hope among some people who have been kind of following the the developing revelations about the U.S. government's possession of, interaction with, holding um, things like technology retrieved from alien crash sites, crash retrieval programs, possibly even non-human sentient life forms. That there's the idea of disclosure is that there's a coming big reveal, and a moment when that is soon, and in which we're going to find out a bunch more. So that's my understanding. It may be wholly wrong. So here's my first question to you, Sean, is tell us what disclosure is.
All right, so I'll start with most recently where kind of Congress stands. So right now there's something called the UAP Disclosure Act of 2025 that people are lobbying for. But every time, and I don't know if it's in this recent bill, but the last one kind of passed ish with, but it had absolutely no teeth. And the reason that was difficult is these people always insist on putting an eminent an eminent domain provision into this thing, which if you're an aerospace company that has been gifted exotic technology from Chinese crashes, Russian crashes, or from somewhere else, okay, you don't want to give that up, right? You want to be compensated in some way. If you're a private citizen who just happened to pick up this debris somewhere, the government has no right to take that from you. But there was an amendment, as part of this that was presented by Senator Schumer and Senator Rounds, so a Democrat and a Republican, and it still had this provision in it. My personal view is that that was always a poison pill to just spoil the bill so no one would pass it. I
Mhm.
don't know if it's in the next one. I would have to double check, but if it is, it's going to spoil the bill and they're not going to pass it. There's also other senators and congressmen who are entirely beholden to the intelligence community, right? So take the Republican congressman in Ohio, Mike Turner. Okay, he got into this marriage with this like wealthy lobbyist, and then subsequently got a divorce. And for some period of time he had negative net worth. He is owned by the defense contractors, right? They have obvious leverage over him. They have obvious leverage from the intelligence community, etc. I actually even interviewed his opponent in a and he was neither Democrat or Republican, but there are there are forces here that Congress will never be able to uncover the full size and scope of all these programs, and there's so much compartmentalization that it would take forever. And then we could go down a whole rabbit hole in terms of who is really in charge of all this. But my understanding at a very basic level is that the executive, I don't want to say department, but the executive branch is wholly in charge of these crash retrieval programs. And the level of classification is at the level of kind of what the Manhattan Project was or higher. Okay.
So this is interesting that this sort of intelligence thread came up immediately, and I think we're going to hear that again. Tell me, when you talk about these bills in Congress that are potentially being spiked deliberately, are these bills that are
In
aimed
my opinion,
at disclosure?
that's
Yeah,
just me, right?
maybe. Are these is the what do the bills do? Are they intended, or are they ostensibly, maybe it's fake, right? Are they ostensibly designed to force disclosure of these programs?
Yes, so there's a timetable for declassifying, you know, information over the last 25 years, something like that, some time period. There's also a disclosure of where these alleged craft are located, and then some mechanism for shifting custody from, these aerospace corporations back to the United States in order to, provide some sense of how long this program has gone on. In congressional testimony, so David Grush, who I believe left the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel, uh, was an intelligence uh, person, testified before the House Oversight Committee in July 2023. In his testimony, he alleged that while he had not directly seen any of these programs, so not necessarily a firsthand witness, although that's he did allegedly have a personal encounter, with a craft or saw a craft, something like that. But he interviewed, I think, 40 plus witnesses across all the intelligence communities in an official capacity as part of his job when he was in the Air Force. And what he learned in that process is that we had recovered craft. Uh, the earliest of those craft may have been a craft that had crashed in Magenta, Italy in 1933. It was recovered by Mussolini's people and stored at a hangar. And then, kind of in the midst of the war, maybe 1943, between the OSS and the Vatican, the Vatican had kind of made the U.S. aware of where that thing was located, and we subsequently recovered it. So, if true, and there are many cases even before that um, I won't discuss here, but the kind of pseudo official government narrative on a faction that wants to disclose. And for all I know, this could just be like professional wrestling. Like, oh, I'm the hero, and oh, I'm the heel. Look at my, twirly mustache. And it's just a broad disinformation campaign with good guys and bad guys.
In other words, maybe
And
who appear to be antagonists to each other are actually collaborating, right? There's like they call kayfabe in professional wrestling is the
that's exactly the word I was going to use, but I didn't think the audience, because I didn't know it when it was used for me. But kayfabe is 100% like
yeah.
exactly what I'm going with.
This
Kayfabe.
is the word that means professional wrestling is theater. There's a narrative, it's an act, it's an athletic kind of theater. Those guys are really strong and tough. I wouldn't walk up and insult one, right? But it is theater, and yeah, so kayfabe. Uh,
Yeah. So just look at the air. Are you familiar with Arrow?
I don't think so.
So it is an organization that was stood up maybe 2 to 3 years ago.
Okay.
Um, I can't remember exactly what it's AARO, right? I can't remember
Okay.
exactly what the acronym is. It doesn't matter. It's a counterintelligence operation, in my opinion.
Okay.
So this is the organization that was led by this man called Sean Kirkpatrick. Look at a picture. He looks like a classic, like Iron Man villain. He looks like the man, like kind of like the Mandarin, um, with his like goatee and dark hair and this and that. And he played his part very well, right? He was just like he would just lie. So I'm sure. I mean, I think he lives near your town. You know who Brandon Fugel is, right?
Oh yeah, I'm aware of Brandon Fugel. We have not met, you know, but I
But he
know
likes Mountain Dew. I know he likes Mountain Dew.
he
So
like that. That's our local
maybe
thing.
we could show up at that 7-Eleven one morning. We get a chance to meet him. But
Ambush him. Yeah, so Fugel's a big real estate developer in the state of Utah. His name is on buildings as you go down the freeway. billionaire. He also famously bought the Skinwalker Ranch and developed I don't know, is it 5 seasons now of television where people ostensibly are investigating paranormal phenomena on this ranch out in eastern Utah, which is a part of the state that was historically called UFO Alley because in the 20th century they had a really high um, rate of reported abductions.
I did not know that.
Yep,
Interesting.
UFO Alley.
Near, was it near Moab at all?
It's north. It's north of Moab. Those are both in eastern Utah, but Moab is in kind of
No,
east.
I mean like the abductions. Was there a high concentration near Moab, Utah? Because that's where they mined uranium.
I think there. Boy, that's a good question. Again, I think the area that's called UFO Alley is north. I don't know whether Moab also might be a place. It might. Um, I have a friend who was a native of Moab and wrote a novel about Moab that's kind of a weird gothic novel, and it does feature alien encounters. So it may be that may be
Anyway, where was I going?
Brandon Fugel, Sean Kirkpatrick.
Yes. So Brandon Fugel recounted this meeting that he had with some intelligence officials back in, I'm going to probably get the year wrong, but 2018. Okay. He alleges Sean Kirkpatrick was in the meeting. Okay. And in the meeting, Brandon Fugel came prepared, I think, with a presentation to convince these people that this phenomenon is real.
Yeah.
And when he kind of started going through his slides, I don't know if it was him or somebody else, this group of intelligence officials said, "Stop. We know this is real, right? Let's just start. Let's talk as if it's real, and let's kind of go through this." So several years later, Kirk, Fugel talked about this and was, and said, "Oh yeah," and Sean Kirkpatrick was in the meeting and agreed to all this stuff. And Sean Kirkpatrick said, "No, never. That's not true. I was never there." Blah blah blah. So Fugel posted a picture, and he's there twirling his goatee, you know, in the room. So there's something to all this. Also, incidentally, Brandon Fugel, he talks about a bad investment that he made by in this guy's company, Joe Firmage. Are you familiar with the whole Joe Firmage story?
I don't know this at all. No.
So he was a Mormon entrepreneur. I believe he is potentially a direct descendant of either Joseph Smith or
Somebody. Yeah.
somebody else. Claims to have had like an abduction experience or a vision of an entity that told him to pursue this path, etc. Turns out that there's another intelligence official who ran the CIA's weird desk. Okay.
Okay.
So are you familiar with this concept? I should probably explain it to the
I don't
audience.
know the weird desk.
Oh boy. Yeah, this stuff goes once you start getting enmeshed with this stuff. So back in like the 1950s, there's this guy, Art Lindell, right?
Okay.
I think he worked for the Navy. He did like all these reconnaissance photos or, stuff like that, and ended up ultimately working for CIA. And then he was assigned to this thing called the Weird Desk, where the CIA investigates all things anomalous. Okay. So anyway, he was kind of the first. I don't know if there's anybody in between, but there's a guy, is a medical doctor. His name was Dr. Kit Green. He was associated with Project Stargate, which was the CIA slash
Remote
Army's
viewing.
remote viewing program. And then Kit Green passed this on to a gentleman named Dr. Robert Pandolfi. And Dr. Pandolfi, if you do a search for him, his name's everywhere, but he never talks to anybody, right? So he's like a PhD in chemistry, etc. But I believe he's in a lawsuit, or he was in a lawsuit related to this Firmage thing, because Brandon Fugel invested a ton of money in this thing and it just didn't pan out. So was it an op? Was it a who knows? But there's so much subterfuge and disinformation in this topic, and it's intentional because it's very difficult to kind of make heads or tails of what's going on. But anyway, that's kind of how Fugel, is related to all this.
Yeah. Um, his background isn't aerospace at all, right? Fugels.
No, he's real estate,
So,
but he's got money.
but he's got
If you
money.
have money, you're a mark. You're always a mark if you have money.
So this is what I wonder, right? So when you say counterintelligence, I guess what I think the function of counterintelligence is to confuse the battlefield for foreign intelligence agencies, to deliberately
As well
face
as
with lies.
as exactly, as well as spy catching.
That's right. Okay, yeah. So that's right. James Jesus Angleton, the
Yes,
the
that
great
that's
spy.
another deep dark figure in this whole thing.
Yeah,
Um, there's another guy named Fred Chrisman who's been involved in a lot of cover-ups, like the Maury Island cover-up, where there's a craft that showed up on Maury Island and it was dripping material, and they covered up, etc. He was also somehow associated with the Kennedy assassination. He was a Army CIC, Counterintelligence Corps, back in the day, which doesn't exist anymore, as far as I know. But in terms of Arrow, what I personally believe, this is just my belief,
yeah,
is that it was stood up in this period of disclosure to prevent deep insiders from coming forward, right? Because, hey, you can talk to us and, we'll make sure that, it uh, you do it legally, etc. But then when you go and talk to them, they write down your story in a skiff and then they say you can never speak of this again. And we know that you tried to leak it. So
yeah. So you think they're basically bait to catch people? It's sort of defectors. It's not quite defectors. It's people who want to go
tell the
public.
truth. Yeah, honest, good people who want to tell or convey a better sense of what the nature of our true reality is.
Yeah. Man, that's a big thing to say, the nature of our true reality. So, so the underlying sort of big themes here are um, there are technological, technical, cosmological secrets um, that some agencies within the U.S. government know. And there is, it sounds like maybe the idea of disclosure is not the belief that there's a coming moment of revelation, but it's the belief that there is a fight, and the hope that the fight will end in stuff being revealed, as opposed to um, the secrets remaining hidden. I mean, is that right? Maybe it depends. Maybe different people think different
Uh,
things.
so I personally think disclosure is so let's go all the way back. Let's go back to
Yeah.
2016 or 2017.
Okay.
Okay. You had the WikiLeaks and the hack of the DNC where
Okay.
they released a bunch of emails. Okay. And in those emails, there were a bunch of Podesta emails that were talking about UAPs and UFOs, etc., as if
Yeah.
they were real, right? And one theory, and I will grant credit where credit is due. This gentleman on Twitter who goes by the name Tupacabra. Uh, so, by the way, he makes fantastic videos. You should check them out. Check out the
Okay.
whistleblowers. Anyway, he kind of said that this kind of leak of the 20, it's his theory, it could be right, it could be wrong, was that in 2017, as a result of this leak, the US government had to conduct what they call in intelligence circles as a modified limited hangout. And what a modified limited hangout is, it's an operation that where if some of the truth is revealed, right? So you just think of truth like an iceberg, right? And at the tip
Okay.
of the iceberg, you have some truth, but then you have like deep, dark truths that are beneath that. So what a modified limited hangout is when the tip of that iceberg, true information leaks. You can't really, it's not like the cat's out of the bag. So what you do is you come in and you say, you shape it, you narrative shape. You say, oh, well, yes, that's true, but and then you spin another story that leads people away from the bottom of the iceberg. I'll give you a real world example that, again, this is my opinion. You're familiar with the MH370 crash, right? The Malaysia flight.
Um, so remind me, I think that this sounds familiar. I think I've heard of this.
Yeah, it's a flight that crashed kind of or just disappeared,
Okay.
right? They claim that there's no wreckage found, a bunch of
Like
people
in the like
died,
in the
etc.
2010s or something, right? Like recent, but not
Yeah,
recent.
like 2014.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a lot of suspicious things about this flight, but right now there's this guy out there. I'm not going to mention his name because I like the guy, but I think he's being um, cheered on by certain faction. Uh, and what he's saying is, he claims to have gotten this video where that aircraft disappears through a portal and like ETs took it, or not. Now he's saying that we have advanced technology that abducted this plane, whatever. However, there are some really strange things about that flight. There were, I think, 20 engineers on the flight, 12 of whom were Chinese scientists. They worked for a company called Freescale Semiconductor. Freescale Semiconductor had signed a contract with the DoD in 2013 to develop these uh, chips, these gallium nitride, I think silicon, and I can't remember the name of the system, slash silicon, right? These chips are used specifically for satellite communications, to be rad hardened in space, etc. So what I think may have happened, and I want to talk very briefly like this because I don't, it's a dangerous topic to talk about, is there were a lot of weird things about that flight. Like these Chinese scientists were employees of Freescale Semiconductor, but they were flying to Beijing, and then from Beijing they were going to fly and start a fab somewhere else. Allegedly, there are FBI agents who were supposed to be on the flight, got calls to get off the flight. There were these lithium ion batteries in the hall, which you're not supposed to fly on airplanes because they can catch on fire. There's an naval intelligence person who uh, was tried for um, espionage, but nobody really talks about, this guy, Edward Lynn. There's a lot of like really sketchy things about it. So, and this story just won't die. So, what I think may have happened is that our people took the flight down. They just took it down. Not UFO related, not phenomenological, just
Just fighter jets or something.
no, no, no,
So,
no, no. I think they could have bribed the guy or threatened the guy, to kill himself or whatever. But bottom line is they didn't want those Chinese scientists getting to China with a highly classified defense technology. Right? I could be completely wrong, but the function of somebody like that was like, yeah, there are lots of suspicious things. Let's throw something out there that's so fantastical that they'll just make a mockery of this, and then people will stop focusing on this question.
yeah.
Right?
So
So
this
that's
is the counterintelligence kind of reading of all this.
yeah, this is like what a modified limited hangout might look like, right? And I'm not saying that this is exactly what it is. It's just a theory that could be plausible in all these situations, right?
Okay. So, uh, it's interesting to me. Um, it seems like at this point, um, first of all, at this point, it seems to me that you somebody's lying, right, about something. Um,
Dave,
probably
if
there's
they're
a
if they're talking, they're lying.
probably there's a whole lot of lying.
Hmm.
My memory is that some of this goes back to now what's his name? The Democratic senator from Harry Reid. Isn't Harry
Hmm.
Reid sort of involved in this kind of story back in like the Bigelow Aerospace days? Like,
Yes, yes, yes,
some,
and that's why he is, because Bigelow is located in Nevada.
yeah,
Harry Reid was a senator in Nevada, and Harry Reid was a allegedly a proponent of disclosure.
yeah,
So there's so much smoke and mirrors here because I could give you 12 different possibilities,
yeah,
right? Given what's going on. The only thing I can say with certainty is what people term the phenomenon. It's
yeah.
real. It is 100% real. Now,
There's
what the
real, there's real
nature,
something.
yes, there's something there.
Yeah,
Now, I'm not as doctrinal as to say I know what it is, because I have there's so much smoke and mirrors. You could come to the conclusion that it's just the Matrix admin kind of poking a hole in to correct the
because we live in a
simulation.
simulation. Yeah,
Right, like that. I hate that one the most. I despise that one, but it's the most parsimonious explanation. It could also be that things that ancient theologians called angels and demons, right? It could be just what they called aspects or certain aspects of the phenomenon. John Keel, who was a writer, he wrote the Mothman Prophecies. He also wrote the Eighth Tower and the it's the Trojan something. I'm not remembering it here, or Operation Trojan Horse. In the Eighth Tower, he talks about something he calls the super spectrum,
okay.
right? Which are just these energies and things like that we can only vaguely perceive, that are operating on the basis of, or just operating with their own agendas, etc. Also calls them ultra terrestrials, right? So again, you can consider angels, demons, some form of ultra, or even ET. If you look at abduction accounts that experiencers talk about, the elements there are very common to elements that Celts would have in fairy lore, right? Where you have the abduction, you have like, someone goes to fairyland, and when they return, they feel like they've been gone a minute and they've been gone for months, right? The whole changeling phenomenon, right, which is very similar to tales of hybridization, all that all that weird stuff. And there's also an occult side to all this. Um, so abductees having strange sigils on their body when they come back from time to time, scoop marks, all sorts of crazy stuff. So I'm not sure how much the intelligence community knows. The excuse that a lot of intelligence officials use is that, yes, we know some stuff, but we don't know enough, so that if the president came out and said, "Hey, we're not alone in the universe," and people would say, "Do we have treaties?" And they may say yes. With whom? Well, where are they from? Well, so there are other theories that it's not like extraterrestrial. There's theories that it's interdimensional. So just think of us living all on one planet and there being a bio or shadow biome that co-inhabits physical space, that's just vibrating at a different frequency. There are all sorts of crazy explanations, but anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but um, it's
So this
hard
is
to really put
interesting
your finger on it.
in terms of like, if we were to sort of conceive this as like a genre fiction question, there are different potential genres here, right? Because it, if you're talking about things like, hey, uh, maybe we have an alliance with a power that is kind of native to Earth, but not limited to Earth in the same way we are, which is what I take you to mean when you say ultra terrestrial. It's not it's not an extraterrestrial, it's not someone from somewhere else. It's something that maybe even is native, but it ultra is beyond. It has it's
Right.
beyond.
It could be. So we have a very narrow aperture of perception, right? So
Sure,
when on an audible scale, we can only hear from 2 hertz to 20,000 hertz.
sure,
Okay. From a on the visual spectrum again, or on the electromagnetic spectrum, it's a very narrow sliver of visible light from red to violet, right? And that's it. We can't see into the ultraviolet. We can't see into the infrared. And the odd thing is, there have been authors, like, you're sure you're familiar with Ambrose Bierce, right? He's got a story about this creature that nobody can see, but they can feel the physical effects of it. And he just kind of says it's of a strange color that we can't perceive. But now you can imagine, at the time he was writing, he probably didn't know about the infrared spectrum, right? Or maybe he did, he just, or it just didn't filter in. But if you imagine a being that is entirely in infrared, you would not be able to see it.
Ambrose Bierce, by the way, disappeared mysteriously. We don't know.
Yeah, he went to ride with Pancho Villa and
He
disappeared.
probably just got shot dead in Mexico. Is probably what happened. Yeah.
But
Uh,
there's apocryphal stories that he like went through a portal or something like that.
right.
So I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm just saying, like,
Well, this
this
is
stuff, like fact and fiction, merge very strangely. And I didn't even get into the whole like Nazi connection in World War II and all that stuff.
well.
There's
I'm
like
interested
strange
in that.
stuff there.
Let's come back and talk about that in a minute. But Ambrose Bierce, I think, is also the guy who is the ultimate originator of the King in Yellow mythology. So he has kind of he's a poet, but also he's kind of a horror writer that's picked up by the King in Yellow is picked up by Robert Chambers and H.P.
Hmm.
Lovecraft. It's the mythology that's behind the season one of True Detective. Um, so there's this, so this is interesting, right? Because like what I was saying about genre, like man, it sounds like some people's idea of what would be happening is broad enough that if they're to discover that, oh, the United States has you know, a treaty with one of the Dukes of Hell, like that might
Yeah,
be
that could totally be. I mean,
what's
look at our
going.
elite. Look at our elite. Like, if you told me
Sure,
that it was a devil worshipping cult that had made signed contracts with infernal entities, it doesn't have to be demonic, but
sure.
I would not be surprised at all. Just look at the compromat chains with Epstein and
I was
Diddy,
just say that would be an explanation
like
of
the
Epstein.
entire rap industry. Like,
Yeah,
who would have thought that, like, most successful rappers were homosexual for at least a day?
yeah, just yeah, to get to make their career work, to get Diddy's
Yeah,
favor.
yeah.
Um, on the other
Who,
hand,
by the way, was also tied to the FBI. And Epstein may have been tied to the Mossad or CIA.
yeah. So on the other hand, maybe so there's like a horror story there. On the other hand, maybe there's like a science fiction story, right? Crash retrievals, it's pure technology. Maybe this is, oh, this is how we really figured out semiconductors. It was just our beginning to get the smallest technological learnings from
So that in
technology.
the day after Roswell,
Yeah,
uh, Colonel Corso, who
yeah,
was a military intelligence guy, I think he helped organize Operation Gladio in in Europe, which is basically using all the intelligence networks of the Nazis to gather intelligence on the Soviets, right at the end of World War II. So he learned, he had some ties potentially to the Vatican, but he also learned from British intelligence on how to do this stuff. And when he came back, he advised General Trudeau, and they had something called the Nut File, which Trudeau had given him a a basket or like a box or crate filled with debris allegedly from Roswell. And Corso's role was to quietly seed that technology into American corporations and just saying, "Hey, we found this in a crash," and somebody would say, "What is it, like a Russian satellite?" Like, yeah, maybe, yeah, it could be, right? And allegedly, this helped develop materials like nitinol, semiconductors, and a variety of other, strange technology, memory metal, all that kind of stuff. Again, Corso was an intelligence operative, so half the stuff he probably put in the book is a lie, and the other half might be true. In terms of Roswell in particular, there are many different explanations about what happened there. There's the Air Force explanation, which is that this Project Mogul balloon crashed, right? And the bodies were just dummies. But again, we didn't have dummies in 1947 or crash test dummies in 1947. So the Air Force's official explanation withers under any serious explanation. But there are people who, I've seen the receipts of people who worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base during that time. There's a person named June Crane. Like, we have access to her work records, her pay stubs. She was a secretary for people in this program, and when she was about to die, I think she had cancer. She met with someone I interviewed and just said, "Look," like, she was laughing at the TV because they were talking about, making fun of somebody who claims they saw a craft or whatever. She's like, "These people, like, they're real. They're real." And he's like, "How do you know?" "Because I worked with people who saw the bodies." So, in terms of how the craft went down, though, there's so much information and disinformation related to it. There are some that I was just reading in a book today that people think that the Nazis developed anti-gravitic technology, and it was a Nazi craft that had crashed there. There are other, um, and the other thing too is the interesting thing about the craft is at the time that that craft crashed, all five of all the nuclear weapons in the world were at the 509th bombing wing at Roswell.
Interesting.
Another theory about Roswell is that, extraterrestrial crash, right? Another is that we shot it down with these um, Black Widow night fighters. Uh, but who knows, right? Either way, there was definitely a crash and there were bodies recovered.
Yeah. So let me throw out another, just, I mean, I don't know. We're thinking about possibilities. So, well, first of all, it seems like most of the sources of information are people who present themselves as witnesses. Uh they come out with a book, or on their deathbed they say, I did this, or um and I mean, people who associate with Roswell are probably at this point mostly dead, right? You'd
Yep.
be old if you were like an adult scientist at Roswell. Um, uh, but some of the more recent people are alive. Do we have? My memory is there's some I don't know, documentary evidence. There's a memo written by a Navy admiral. Am I remembering this right? What's that called?
It depends on which.
There's more than one. Okay.
Yeah, there's all sorts, and some are fake. Like, there's Psalm 101, which is a field manual on crash recoveries, right? It talks about handling hazardous materials and, like, dealing with these things. I don't know if it's real, but I've seen the manual.
Yeah.
There's the Majestic 12 document, um, which are alleged to be hoaxed, but some people say no, it's not hoaxed, it was real. But that was allegedly a group of very senior officials who knew about this. So, like, Admiral Forrestal, um, Vannevar Bush, like that caliber of people. So Vannevar Bush went on to found. I think he was like a PhD at Harvard at the time. He went on to found Raytheon,
Hmm.
right? Admiral Forrestal. Um, I can't say this word because YouTube will unalived himself.
Oh yeah.
Um, oh, whoa.
What was that?
If you do anything with your fingers on Zoom, these things happen. Uh, but Forrestal was likely murdered, right?
Yeah.
So, um, anyway, yeah, there are a number of different. There's a Rand study that talks about disclosure. There's a 1961 speech at West Point that MacArthur delivers and talks about the potential of, uh, going to space and things like that, but it's a little bit specific in a weird, odd way. So, yeah, there's tons of these documents. It's becoming easier and easier to fake. And there's also like a psychic element to all this stuff too that people don't talk about. So
Yeah, I
the
want to come
reason
back to
I
that. Hold
yeah,
on.
yeah.
I want to hear about this. I know you've talked to remote viewers and stuff, and so have I. I met Paul Smith. I think of as my friend, fairly recent friend. Um, Let me propose a possibility to you, and tell me what you think. So, given that it looks like, I mean, some of the people that have come forward as witnesses are themselves like known counterintelligence agents, right? Like Lou Elizondo, isn't he
That's what his career was,
was a career
counterintelligence.
counterintelligence officer?
That's why he does wacky things. Like during a hearing, he holds up an obviously fake photo. He's done it twice
Yeah,
to and he has the training to know not to do that. Are you familiar? You're familiar with Whitley Strieber, right?
yeah,
So in a recent interview with Whitley Strieber, I just kind of said, look, there's 0% chance that Lou Elizondo did that accidentally,
yeah,
right? And Whitley Strieber was more generous. He's like, well, I'm still not sure, like I've done things in the past that like, where I just made a mistake and things like that. And I said, but Whitley, would you make that mistake in front of Congress? And he's just like, no. So,
So what about this? What about this? What about a different genre? What if the genre of this is all straight thriller? What if it is all BS? And what the sort of distractors are trying to distract from is something that is purely political in nature, right? In other words, hey, distracting from the fact that the CIA has been running foreign policy for years, or distracting from questions about what really did happen to the Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King, right? Like, is it possible that this is the whole thing is a kind of a modified limited hangout to sort of say there are people out there who have the kind of inquisitive intelligence and creativity and curiosity that we really don't want them thinking too much about Charles Manson and his connections with federal law enforcement. So we will distract them with aliens.
so there is a scenario that could fit that. Okay.
Yeah,
And the most plausible scenario with that would be something that's called strategic deception. Now, strategic deception is a lie or series of lies that's meant to stand the test of time. So, for some very long period of time, say 10 years minimum.
yeah.
Okay. And the reason I know about this is uh, another remote viewer, David Morehouse,
Mm.
we recorded an episode of something of an operation that he conducted in strategic deception before or after he left the remote viewing program. The name of the operation was Torn Image. And it was meant to, at the time, this is when Pablo Escobar was operating in Colombia. There were, I think, two other major cartels, the Cali cartel and the like I forget the other one. But what his mission was to burn out the both to burn out both the or basically the supply side, right? Just
Medellin, right?
Medellin, yes.
That's
Yeah,
the other.
like
Sorry.
to get them to basically kill each other.
Yeah.
And so what he did was he devised this scheme where in parallel he had there were people at Los Alamos National Laboratory working on a like a pestilence or like a bacterium or some sort of biological component that would attack the psychoactive component of coca leaves. At the same time, they arranged operations where they would have aircraft that were with tail numbers that were similar to the cartels, and then they would go fly over opposing cartels' fields and spray. Okay. They would also intercept shipments of cocaine before this alleged bioparasite or whatever, right, was synthesized. They would intercept cocaine shipments, remove the psychoactive component chemically, and then seed it back into the drug distribution platform. The operation was so effective that Pablo Escobar had the head of one of the cartels chainsawed to death. The cartels started going to war with each other and burning themselves out. And then there were also conflicts in the continental United States, downstream in the delivery platform where, gangbangers started killing each other because they were getting inert cocaine, right? And they thought they were being stiffed, even though they weren't being stiffed. The U.S. intelligence community was moving south. So it was so effective that within 6 months, they ceased operations on it because all the money that they were spending on this drug war, they want to slow down the candy, right?
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, so David Morehouse had a scheme that almost single-handedly ended the drug war. But anyway, that's an example of strategic deception. So if you imagine that the US, and again, you could look it up. It's on my channel. It's called Torn Image. He tells the story much better than I can because he was there. You could imagine a situation where we have some exotic technologies that we don't want released. So in order to get rid of prying eyes, we create this whole mystique around an abduction, or not abduction, but like UAPs
Yeah.
and and
All
and,
the
and, and
scenarios.
things like that.
Yeah.
Now, the intelligence community almost certainly uses that on certain occasions to cover up things. They'll blame it on UAPs and things like that. They may have done so with the stealth fighter, that sort of thing. But there's enough that happens that there's something real to all this. We talked about the Stargate program specifically, right? There's a there for sure.
Yeah. And you were about to talk about the sort of psychic component when I derailed you. So I'm interested in getting back to that when you're ready.
Yeah, so they did a lot of research. It kind of started out with something called Project Gondola. I don't know how to spell gondola, but or if I pronounce it correctly, Gondola Wish. And what that was, I think, is the DIA had a program to systematically analyze anything that the Soviets were doing that involved weaponizing paranormal or psychical techniques, predominantly to spy or attack American citizens. And what they found was it was a pretty extensive program. A lot of the literature was open in the public. Soviet scientists were publishing papers on the phenomena, on this, various human potential
Yeah.
things. And slowly it's just started going dark, right? So it went from kind of public domain to more secret study. They identified all the places in St. Petersburg at the time, Leningrad and Moscow, and other places that were working on this stuff. And it very likely freaked the Soviets out. So we started, I think we first conduct I think we conducted a test of psychic communication to the USS Nautilus, which is a submarine. Um, I don't know many details about that. Um, and there's other stuff that could be it's apocryphal that may have been before this and related to kind of some of the work that Tesla did, some of the work associated with the alleged Philadelphia experiment, all that stuff with warping space time and all sorts of crazy stuff.
You're talking, I
But
mean, those are like huge doors you're presenting there. You mean Nikola Tesla, not Tesla, the car manufacturer.
yeah, Nikola Tesla, who Fred Trump, working at the FBI, who was President Trump's uncle, when Tesla died, he sent a team in and they confiscated all of Tesla's work.
That's interesting.
So, um, yeah, regardless, going back to this Project Gondola Wish, DIA conducted this study, and then that ultimately led to a series of projects. And you can look all this up. It's on the CIA's website. It's been declassified, right? These are declassified documents from like the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I'm not sure what the order was, but there was a Project Centerlane, Project Grill Flame, and Project Stargate. Okay, probably roughly in that order. But there was a study that someone named Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, Dr. Hal Puthoff and Dr. Russell Targ, conducted at the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, back in kind of the 1970s. They invited a bunch of psychics or alleged psychics to just study their abilities to affect outcomes in the real world. So psychokinesis, um, clairvoyance, all that stuff. So remote viewing is kind of what came out of that. And it was packaged as remote viewing because it would be easier for people to accept other than kind of clairvoyance. But there were several people who were amazing at it. Ingo Swann is kind of number one, and he developed the protocols that the US Army used. They call it coordinate remote viewing, CRV, which was eventually developed, like innovated into something called extended remote viewing, which is a little bit more freeform. At the same time, they were also looking at out of body experiences, right? Like astral projection, which people confuse this. I see people in the intelligence community all the time confuse it. So, remote viewing is not the same thing as out of body experiences or astral projection. You'll hear about it in near death experiences and things like that, where people report seeing themselves from a third point of view, the projected out of body, things like that. Well, at the same time, the CIA looked at doing OBEs for the same thing, obviously spying, right? The difference between OB and OBE, out of body experience, and remote viewing is you just sit down at a table, you're given a white sheet of paper, and you're given, you know, a string of letters or numbers, right? The letters and numbers correspond to a particular target. Initially, in the early days, they were using geospatial coordinates, but people can, military officer will be able to figure out like what part of the world you're sending them. So then they just scrambled them and made them just random numbers. Okay.
Effectively random numbers, yeah.
But the point of it all is if you assigned a number to a specific target that you're looking for, and nobody can explain how this works, but it just does. When they were running these experiments, they would have like the Ingo Swans of the world and the Pat Prices of the world. They would just give them a number and they would just say, describe what you see. And then they would just sketch kind of, what they were seeing. And these things were tremendously accurate, like outside of, like well beyond statistical significance. There's a statistician, her name's like Jessica Utz, who studied this for the CIA because it leaked in 1995. because of David Morehouse, who obviously they tried to murder him, or somebody tried to murder him because they turned his generator on at night in his garage and filled his house with carbon monoxide. And if his cat hadn't like jumped on him, he would have, his whole family would have died. And they found nothing but like two footprints at outside his door. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So when it was leaked, the CIA basically hired two people to kind of look at it. One of the people just said, "Yep, it's not real. It's all. We only spent $20 million over a 20-year period on something that didn't work."
Yeah.
Right. But Jessica Utz, like statistically, a statistician, she said, "Yeah, this is beyond chance that it works." There were also efforts at Princeton. It was called the PAIR. It's like the paranormal. I can't remember. I don't know what it's PEAR. It's like the paranormal experimental, something research or something institute or something like that. It was funded by Lawrence Rockefeller, which I only recently learned. So there's a lot of like the same figures who keep showing up in this thing. Like I talked about Crispin and James Jesus Angleton. Like those people appear constantly
Yeah.
in this topic.
So, so I think my understanding is wrong. That is, I don't think this is like a sort of uh an expectation that things um will be disclosed, but it's like a quest to try and find what the truth is. And, you know, at the same time, there's a sort of a political effort, maybe half-hearted, maybe compromised, to try to make the government disclose.
Yeah, so I believe that Congress is definitely intent on getting disclosure.
Yeah.
I don't think the executive branch or the institutional bureaucracy has any intention of letting this thing out because there's so much associated with it. So I'll give you an example of how dangerous some of this stuff is. There's a guy, his name was Dr. Menzel. He was worked at the Harvard's astronomy department back in the 1950s. There are photographic plates that, like a period of 10 years, that Harvard, it's missing because he destroyed them. Oopsie. And the reason he destroyed them is there's these things called transients, right? So if you just take a star map and look at it for a particular period of time, or one of these old star maps, you'd see normal stars in the constellation, but there would be from time to time anomalous lights that were captured on these plates, right? So he just destroyed the evidence, and he was a known intelligence operative. So there is a huge secret about reality that people in the deep, dark bowels of the government are trying to hide. Now, part of it is self explanatory, right? So, remote viewing, like I could peer inside any place, anywhere in the world, anytime I want, and get a pretty good picture. And if I use like 10 people who are looking at the same target, and you take all the commonalities, because people make mistakes, there's an interpretation aspect to remote viewing, right? You want to raw intuition, but your analytical mind, it's called analytical overlay, will sometimes interfere. But if you get enough people, you can get an accurate picture of just about anything, and there's nothing the government can do to stop you. So imagine if the CIA knows that every human has this capability, they just don't know about it. And if you allowed the population to awaken, you couldn't keep secrets anymore.
Yeah. Um, Although, okay, so what do you make of the fact that we've talked about David Morehouse and Paul Smith? I think both those guys basically offer classes on how to do remote viewing. So are they taking their lives in their hands, or are they a modified limited hangout? Are they a fake? Or are they part of are they teaching a compromised art that won't work?
I don't want to say no. I would just assess it in terms of probabilities. I would say less than 3% chance that what they're offering is fake. This technology or these techniques were used 30 years ago. Okay. So imagine the level of innovation that, the US government claims that they don't use this stuff anymore, but I think it just went blacker, right? It just, because it works. They had a huge number of successes. There's a time that Jimmy Carter, like, made a huge mistake publicly because he didn't quite call it remote viewing, but he said, yeah, a psychic found a Tupolev bomber within like a mile of its crash site in Africa that we couldn't find through satellites and conventional means. Like, just nailed it. And he mentioned it publicly. He's like, "Yeah, that was the one of the strangest things I've ever seen." So this stuff is real. It's just a question of how much is it. So I think from a governmental standpoint, there's a huge potential threat, and there is a incentive to retard human potential, right? So they don't want to talk about that. So right now, what are they talking about? They're talking about craft. All right, that's a safe topic. Yeah, they're lights in the sky. We don't know what they are. So what? Right? It could be anything. We just haven't figured it out yet. Now they've gone to bodies, which that's that's kind of weird. But they will not talk about or they're starting to talk about the paranormal aspects, right? You hear about this CE5 movement, right? Where you can summon, allegedly, these UFOs, right? It's like the Stephen Greer protocols and stuff like that. Who knows? I'm a little bit more skeptical about that.
No,
But
but you are convinced there's something.
there's definitely something, because the other thing about this topic is when you start to focus on it and you start to spend time studying it, it's like, when you stare into the void long enough, sometimes the void stares back at you.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that stuff that starts happening. I'll give you a crazy real world example. I'll give names because we've talked about it. So there's an experiencer. He's seen like a craft hovering over his house, and again, I have to take his word on it. I don't think there's any reason for him to lie. But his name's James Iandoli, and one day I've been thinking about for a while, I should contact this guy and interview him. So I DM him on X and said, "Hey, would you like to come on as a guest of my show?" And he responds instantly, "Absolutely, but let me tell you something else. I had a dream last night that I was on your show." Like, that's the kind of weird, strange stuff that happens. One thing that happened to me was I had like these dreams about the philosophy of the Unabomber. Now, Dave, I'm I don't think about the Unabomber ever. I'm not like
With a hoodie and a nice pair of sunglasses, Sean.
exactly. Maybe I should just adopt that motif. But it's not something I was like thinking about. But I had this dream about it. I'm like, what the hell was that? I get downstairs, sit at my computer, turn it on, and on Twitter it says Ted Kaczynski died today. There's like stuff like that. That's just, it's weird. Or you've seen probably a million times of the great horned owl that like landed on my back fence, and I was able to approach it within 5 feet get 1,000 photos of it. Like that's not normal. Like there's stuff like that that happens, synchronicities, right? Like seeing certain numeric combinations over and over again, like 1111, things like that, that start to happen. I talked about these precognitive dreams. That's not the only one, by the way. Um, but you'll get dreams that you'll hear a word in the or you'll see a word in the dream and you're like, what the hell's that? And then you'll look it up and it'll be completely in line with the dream, but it's a word you don't understand, you didn't understand before you had the dream, right? So I won't get into that one, but followed by like a dream that turned out to be precognitive 10 months later. So we all have human potential is vaster than we we truly understand it to be. So, and also when people start to meditate, right, that these things start to happen as well. And in Western culture, we really don't have any experience to describe it, whatever. But in Eastern culture, in Hinduism, and things like that, people are taught that, yeah, these are cities, right? They're on the path to enlightenment, you will get these distractions, right? And they advance to the point of getting to like levitation, psychokinesis, things like that. So there's definitely that aspect to it. The other aspect to it is this non-human intelligence aspect, right? Like there may be something or someone that reaches out and interacts with us, but in a way that is subtle and very difficult to track. So, I mean, I'll give you another example. There was a recent Sean Ryan interview with Dave Mustang. You know who Dave Mustang is?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, the lead singer of Megadeth, he talked about finding this book, just like on hexes, and I'm not going to get into the story. You can check out the podcast, but there were two occasions on where he hexed somebody. One in one case to harm them, in another case to get to have an interaction with a certain lady that was very improbable. And it worked again before he was, when he was a skinny, awkward, redheaded little kid, right?
Sure.
But they both worked. However, it kind of opened a door to something that was a lot more malevolent. You take schizophrenics, right? Or schizophrenics, like the way that we modern medicine treats schizophrenics is they just dull their perception. But what if the filter on their brain is just a little bit as a wider aperture perception than we do? Because they tend to hear, voices, sometimes see images. I've interviewed someone who spent 40 years in both a hospital settlement or just in institutions working with paranoid schizophrenics. And he started to notice very strange patterns. And when he was working in a prison, he started to kind of experiment with different techniques that were outside of this whole just dull the meds. And he came to the conclusion that what he was dealing with is these people weren't crazy. They were being harassed by parasitic entities, right? Call them demons, call them whatever it is. So anyway, our reality is far broader and richer than we care to admit.
So that it seems to me is like the overall theme of what you're saying here is that in ways that we don't understand and in ways that interact with each other, that reality is different from what we think, and there is this sort of a quest to understand how, and the US government seems to know something.
Oh,
And
they definitely know. They know a lot more than we do, but there are times the tell is always if there's an experiencer who has something kind of crazy happen to them. So Chris Bledsoe is an example. where he's seen like this or interacted with this, call it a Marian apparition,
Okay.
right? Called the Lady.
Sure.
And whenever the intelligence community shows up at your door when you're having these apparitions,
Yeah.
that's a sign that there's something there.
Sure.
Okay. So that's kind of usually the first tell in all this. Now, some of it could just be a deliberate operation, but in that case, they locked him down for like 10 to 15 years.
Oh, Chris Bledsoe. So let's okay. So let me ask a sort of a what next question to sort of maybe wind up here. If people have listened to this and they said, "Okay, I'm interested, but Sean, this is like this is big. I can't just like go, you know, uh read Cliff Notes somewhere that's going to summarize what's going on." So obviously, if people want to learn more about this, one thing they could do is check out your podcast Through a Glass Darkly, which is here on YouTube and everywhere that fine podcasts are consumed. Are there particular episodes you'd recommend people start with?
What I would recommend is I have playlists for different categories. So focus on one aspect of the phenomenon that you're most interested in, right? So if it's remote viewing, I have a playlist for that. I would recommend that's probably the best path to go in there, because if you start in the deep end on the UFO side, some of the stuff is so crazy or seemingly crazy that you won't believe it. You should start with the remote viewing side, because that's where our government invested money, because it worked.
Yeah,
And then from there, you'll see that those commonalities, you can start with some of the more mundane things that people are seeing. The government tends to focus on nuts and bolts, right? Like the technological aspects of these craft. But there are also esoteric elements that they, never talk about, or they avoid. So I'll give you an example. I talked about Art Lundell. I think one of the first things that uh, they did is there's a woman up in Maine who was channeling information. And and it was remarkably accurate. So some intelligence operatives like, well, can you teach us how to do that? And so they did, and they tested it, I think, at the Pentagon, and a UFO just showed up, like hovering outside the window. So a lot of these families, and this is where it gets crazy, uh, would start would get involved in seances and things like that. So, and in one instance, a group of prominent families in New England, um, I think every one of which person who was there was in some way associated with the Kennedy assassination like 10 years later. Just some association, but they channeled this group called the Council of Nine, which you mentioned Manson. There's like a relationship to that there. Like there's a guy named Andrej Puharich who's associated with this stuff, who is no longer with us, but again, CIA links, all sorts of stuff. So I know I'm like throwing a ton of stuff out there, but just start with remote viewing,
yeah,
and then decide where you want to go there. You can kind of look at the UFO stuff. There's some stuff that's more solidly anchored in reality, and then there's other stuff that is not. If you want to take a very hard scientific approach first before you get into more of this esoteric speculative stuff, I recommend people read UFOs and Nukes by Hastings, uh, where he just interviews plant personnel, uh, nuclear launch off missile, missile launch officers, or more missileers. I don't know what they're necessarily called, where he just meticulously documents, because UFOs often, or UAPs often, show up in um, nuclear nuclear sites,
hmm,
and it seems that there's an intense interest in kind of protecting the planet. Why? Was it protecting us, protecting the planet? You've heard about the New Jersey drone flap recently.
Yeah, just quite recently.
The interesting part about that is they first showed up in Langley Air Force Base,
Mm.
or actually maybe in the West. But where it gets really interesting is in January 2024, the as you know, the Ukraine Russia war is still ongoing. The Brits, for the second time in a period of 8 years, first time was, I think, 2016. The second time was in 2024. They tested a like Trident missile, which is attached to, they have like three nuclear submarines. So it's their deterrent against Russia. For the second time in that period, the missile failed. Okay. So the Brits have a conundrum. They have no credible deterrent. So as a result, the US ships a bunch of uh, nuclear gravity bombs to several bases. I think Lakenheath, um, Mildenhall, and Feltwell. Okay, and again, all clandestinely. You can look it up. There's maybe one article in some obscure journal, and they kind of probably did that in sometime in 2024. Almost immediately, UAP sighting, they're UAPs, but they're calling them drones because the intelligence community is playing on neuro linguistic programming, so that if you call it a drone, everybody will think it's a little quadcopter or whatever. But all these kind of mysterious lights, things like that, appear over these sites. No one can tell anybody what they are. The Brits send either the Special Boat Service, the SBS, it's equivalent to U.S. Navy SEALs, or SAS, the Special Air Service, which is the um, what basically we modeled Delta off of. Okay, these guys had special drone technology, like couldn't take them down, nothing. Then they appeared over Picatinny Arsenal in the United States, which is like a weapons development place, potentially where they put together the triggers for these weapons. I'm speculating on that, but since everything seems to be nuclear related, so they're flying all over. Then they fly the day before Trump takes office. They fly over Bedminster or whatever, right? Just to make a point. They also, this is not reported, but there were retired Air Force personnel sending friends of mine video of these drones flying over Barksdale Air Force Base, which is in Louisiana. That's where the 8th Strategic Bomber Wing is. And those are the bombers that they put these nuclear gravity bombs on to drop them over enemy. You know, I think they're like what? Um, I'm gonna get the B. That's not B-29, but one of these kind of bombing platforms. They also appeared over nuclear power plants, Salem nuclear power plants in nuclear power plant in New Jersey. They appeared over nuclear power plants in Louisiana. So whatever this is was conducting a demonstration and then also the Russians tested the Oreshnik, right? Which means it basically means Hazlett in Russian, but like Hazlett, like
Does it?
Hazlett. Yeah, yeah, it does.
Pretty funny.
It's oddly synchronistic, but this thing was a hypersonic ballistic missile, right? Which is like very scary stuff. And that was after we started attacking, not we, well, we were like setting everything up, and then some like Ukrainian was pressing the missile to take out early warning radars in Russia. Again, hugely escalatory. So very likely we became very close to nuclear war at the end of 2024. And these things tend to show up anytime where we mess with a lot. Like the biggest UFO waves that occurred before that were like in the 1952, where they flew over the Capitol. and also 1954. 1954 was when we detonated the first hydrogen bomb, or I don't, or 52 or 54. It's one of those things. But we were doing all sorts of open above ground nuclear testing. So if you consider that shadow biome thesis, right, it could be that, we can blow each other up here in this dimension, but once you start messing with nukes, you also damage other dimensions, or whatever you want to call it, other realities,
Sure.
that these things have to intervene. But again, that is it's pure speculation. Let's just say it's informed speculation on my part.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
And by the way,
yeah.
no every cover story that the US government put up was just smacked down instantly and ridiculed on X, and they kept changing the story, right? So I think one of the things was, oh, it's just hobbyist drones. Really? Hobbyist drones the size of SUVs flying over nuclear power plants? Really? And then they started talking about, oh, they're from Iranian motherships. So of course on X, using like AI tools like Sora, you had all these like Iranians like on flying drones with like, oh, Allahu Akbar, like singing in the background. And then they came up with, oh no, it's transnational, and they're just like, oh really? So Russia, you want to get this straight? Russia gave a drone technology to MS-13 or some transnational actor that could penetrate U.S. airspace at will anytime they want, and they just, instead of using it themselves, they just gave it to MS-13, right? So that crumbled. Then when Trump took office, he didn't announce because he promised to, kind of get to an answer within 1 or 2 days.
This was the question I was about to ask you, actually, and this is interesting. Maybe this is the point to end on. Yeah. So go ahead, and then I want to. Yeah.
Yeah. So instead of like when Trump delivers, he wants to do it himself. But when he has to kind of like drop a dud on something, he'll just hand it to somebody else. So Levitt came out and said, "Oh, these are just research drones, FCC approved, yada yada yada." So people are asking like, FCC, did you approve this? And they're like, no, we don't know what these things are. So like our government's lying to us about something. And now they're getting 60 Minutes to spin and say it's Chinese drones. And
So
it's just like,
so I could have sworn um, that I saw, and I think it was during the campaign, Trump at some point, someone asked him about UFOs, right? Because he had been president. And I thought he said something like, "Oh yeah, it's very, very interesting," right? And my memory is that maybe, man, this is, you may remember this better than me. The conversation was asking about things that he would make public, right? Epstein, Kennedy, UFOs, and he had
yep,
his
all
thought,
three have not been delivered upon
and all three
correctly
have
yet.
not been delivered. Yeah,
Right.
so it doesn't seem like, whatever one may think of the virtues of Donald Trump, so far he's not the guy who tells us what the government's secrets are.
Maybe he can't.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe they tried to kill him twice.
Well, see, like I said, there are many different possible genres you could
I think it's all related. I think that's the problem. I think the lies are so deep and extensive that it would result in the like it would be the veritable equivalent of Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake," and then guillotines in the streets. Like I think that's what we're playing with,
yeah.
right? I mean, I don't want to get into like, I mean, look at the lab leak, right? Like they lied to us the entire time, and then they pardoned Fauci going all the way back to 2014.
Yeah,
What was he
exactly.
doing in 2014?
Right. Mysterious. Well, among other things, if people are still looking for something to write a novel about with the theme of America 2076, I think this is a deep, rich broth out of which many plots could be drawn. So, Sean, I feel like we're gonna have to have more conversations in the future, but I really appreciate you coming on today. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, apologies for the data dump, but this stuff is like, I spent 3 years just absorbing this stuff, and now it's just all coming out.
No, I think that's fantastic. It's been really interesting. Fantastic. For those of you viewers who are watching, thank you. I look forward to seeing you again back on the Gopherwood Lounge. Remember that the humans win in the end.